We have a couple of readings We have a couple of readings to read through this morning. One from the book of Numbers, the other from Luke, and they should be up on the screen. From Numbers 15, the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corners of your garments, with a blue cord on each tassel. You will have these tassels to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of the Lord, that you may obey them and not prostitute yourselves by chasing after the lusts of your own hearts and eyes. Then you will remember to obey all my commands and will be consecrated to your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God." And from Luke chapter 8. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds also almost crushed him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." I'd encourage you to open your Bibles or to grab one of the Bibles in front of you. Open it up to Luke chapter 8. We're going to dig into that passage this morning. It's close to a year now, we've been spending in John, and we're going to let Pastor Ian next week come back into that book, but we're going to take a 1-week break and look at a story that's in the other 3 Gospels, and all 3 of them, and we're going to look at the version in Luke. For the record, the title of the sermon is an accident. I do not mean that I am moving on to exile towards hope. That's not. I told someone the sermon title, and they said, "Is that what you're saying to us?" I told it to Judy, and she was highly offended. So what we're going to do this morning is dig into that story that we just read from Luke 8. We're going to split it up into 3 movements or 3 sections. The first one is to do with exile and isolation and alienation and living a life of despair. The second, we're going to look at tassels and moving towards hope. So we'll look a little bit at that passage from Numbers and tassels. Last, we're going to look at what's in a name. So if you're a parent and you've named someone, you know that when you name them, it's like an act of love and an act of knowing someone deeply. So we're going to look at what's in a name. We'll probably toss in some Greek or Hebrew words just for fun, and throw in a thing about bowling too, because bowling's fun. Let's begin. We're going to place ourselves into the story from the Bible of that nameless woman who was living a life of exile. So from Luke 8, the woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. You know, she'd probably figured out some routines, some strategies for coping with her life as it was. She'd probably, sorted out a way to write out a grocery list for, maybe she had a daughter who could take that list to the market and come home with the groceries and with the water for the week. She'd probably figured out a routine or a strategy for a regular life of prayer and worship, because she wasn't allowed to go to the temple at all. She'd probably gotten used to the idea that her husband could never touch her, couldn't even put his hand on her cheek. He certainly couldn't lay in the same bed with her. So for 12 years, she hadn't felt his touch. And she had to be extremely careful not to leave any dirty laundry on the floor. Clearly she wasn't a bachelor. But leaving no dirty laundry on the floor for fear that somebody might step on it, making themselves ceremonially unclean, just like she was considered to be. I think we can maybe associate or at least sympathize with the physical. We often look at her physical ailments because we can relate to weakness. After 12 years of suffering, she was probably rather weak. And so throughout that 12-year period, with increasing weakness from iron deficiency and all that, it's unlikely that she would have left home. She was probably a prisoner in her own home, living in exile from this physical ailment that she had. But beyond that, there was the emotional, the spiritual exile that she was in. Her own laws, the Jewish laws back in Leviticus, would have deemed her ceremonially unclean, meaning she couldn't touch anyone or really anything for fear of making other people unclean as well. If there were ever a woman or a person in the Bible who defined what exile is, she would be it. If you're looking in a dictionary, her picture would be right there. This is exile. She could hear the noise out her window of community and joy and laughter, but she could never be a part of it. She was exiled in her own house. I wonder how many of you have ever been in a bowling league before, part of a bowling team. Put your hand up if you've ever been a part. There were a few more people. Oh, no, they're there. Okay. I was going to say there were a few more people in the first service, but then the latecomers came. There was this study done by a Harvard professor named Robert Putnam. He's a smart guy because he's a professor at Harvard, but he decided to study bowling. What he found was that after World War II, especially, league bowling, so teams of bowlers, went on the increase. And decade after decade, the number of teams and leagues of bowling, people that enjoyed bowling, was on the rise. But then something changed. And in about 1980, from 1980 to 1993, participation in leagues dropped by 40%. And when he did his study in 2000, he found that participation in bowling was at an all-time high, but league bowling was at an all-time low. And he figured that if the trend continued by somewhere between 2010 and 2020, which is where we live now, league bowling might be gone or might be very hard to find. Is anyone in a league right now? Right? There we go. So what he found interesting about this, and why a Harvard professor studied this, was because this showed him that what we used to do in groups, we now do alone. Participation in bowling is at an all-time high, but we don't do it together anymore. We do it alone, by ourselves. So he titled his work Bowling Alone. And this woman that was in exile, she was in exile from a physical thing that affected every other aspect of her life. But in many ways, people today experience that same kind of exile because those things that we used to do in community and in groups and together, we now do by ourselves. We now do them alone. And it's important to note that this data actually started in 1980. So it's before we could blame it on the internet. It's before we could blame it on video games. It's before we could blame it on Pokemon Go. Right, Aiden? Yeah. This data is from before all of that existed. So we were already on this trajectory, having this trend that we wanted to do things on our own. And then these tools that we got, this internet and the social media and video games, just made that more accessible to us, that we could take these things we used to do together and do them alone. If we go back to our passage, if you got a Bible open to Luke chapter 8, I'm just going to read a verse or two. It says in verse 40, "Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were expecting him." Doesn't say why they were expecting him, doesn't say if Jesus sent a party out ahead to announce, "Hey, Jesus is coming." It just says they were expecting him. Could have been maybe because this is Galilee, and they just knew Jesus because that's where he grew up. Could be that people in that town knew Jesus' friends or knew his family and knew that he was coming around that area. Doesn't really say, but there seemed to be this expectation, this knowledge that Jesus would show up. And so the lady who was living in exile could hear the whispers outside of her window. Or maybe she could, maybe her kids, if she had any, or her husband, if she had one, they would come home and tell her, this Jesus guy is coming. Remember him? He used to live around here. He used to be a little kid around here. And he's coming back. Later on, the passage says that a woman who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her, she came up behind Jesus and touched the edge of his cloak, and she was immediately healed. Now, when you read that passage, I've often done this many, many times. We often think she reached out and she just got the edge of his cloak. Maybe she was trying to not get noticed because she shouldn't be outside of her house. Or maybe she was shy or timid about it and didn't want to bother Jesus, so she just touched just the edge of his clothing. But what she was doing is actually fascinating in the trust and the hope that she had. There was this prophecy from about 450 years earlier in Malachi, which was the last book of the Old Testament. And it reads like this: "For you who revere my name, the Sun of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays." So it's sun like a star, S-U-N. "For you who revere my name, the Sun of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays." So over those 450 years, rabbis had begun to discuss this passage, and they figured that Sun of Righteousness meant the Messiah, the coming Messiah. So it would read like, "For you who revere my name, the Messiah will come with healing in his rays." But that word rays is this Hebrew word, pronounced chanafayim, which is really fun to say, which literally means wings or edges. So the Messiah will come with healing in his edges. So they began to discuss this, the rabbis, over 450 years, and decided it meant that the tassels of the prayer shawl of the Messiah will have healing powers. The tassels. Have you ever seen one of those prayer shawls that Jewish people still wear today? It's white and blue, and it has tassels on the end. So this lady wasn't being timid. She wasn't being shy. She had a mission. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was reaching for those tassels, for the edge of his cloak, because that, she believed, if this Jesus is the Messiah, those tassels are going to heal me. So it wasn't a timid, a shy act by a nameless woman. She was being audacious. She was being brazen. She left her house with that mission of, I'm going to grab these tassels, and maybe, just maybe, that Jesus is the Messiah, and those tassels can heal me. That miracle will happen because he is the Messiah. She had this amazing hope that she could be healed. She'd spent all of her money on doctors, all of her family fortune was gone, but maybe this Jesus can heal me. Now, it's a whole other message, a whole other sermon series to discuss how tassels can heal someone, how Jesus could say, I felt power go out from me. And then a whole other series about Jairus and his daughter. Those two stories are interwoven. How Jesus brings a 12-year-old girl back from the dead is interwoven with the story of a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. But we don't have time for the story of Jairus and his daughter. I just want to focus on one last bit. So if we put ourselves back in the story, verse 47, it says this: "The woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet." You see, this was probably a small rural town, and everybody knew who she was. And everybody knew that she should not be there. Everyone knew that her very presence made them all unclean, and that they'd have to segregate themselves until sundown, according to their law, and then they could become clean again. And it's possible even that if Jesus was from this area, he looked at her and he knew exactly who she was too, and that she shouldn't be there. She'd done the unthinkable. She'd gone into this crowd, and every single person that she bumped up against, she made them unclean. And so she's terrified, thinking, what are they going to do to me? What is that anger? How's that going to come out in them? And what's this Messiah going to say to me because he knows I shouldn't be there, that I've made everyone else unclean, that I've broken our own law? But instead of any ridicule, instead of any punishment, Jesus calls her by a name. Did anyone catch what the name is? It's in verse 48. Daughter. In no other place in the Gospels does Jesus call anyone daughter. Even when later on in this story he's raising this 12-year-old girl from the dead, he doesn't call her daughter. But this woman who was an outcast, this woman who was nameless, this woman who felt worthless and was shunned from her own society, the Messiah looks at her and says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Daughter. Zion, this is my last Sunday here. There's cake to celebrate. I've only served here for 3 years. It's been an amazing 3 years, but my family's been here for 22. I remember remember the old projection cart that would sit right here, and they would project up onto a screen that still comes down from up there, and that was my first duty. I would press the down button like Nick is doing so dutifully. My roots are here. This is my family here, and I'm going to miss this place. This is my home. If I may take these 3 movements in our story and relate them back to you. Zion, you are an amazing family. You come in here and it feels like a family reunion. But there are people in our midst who are still living a life of exile. There are people who come to church even here and feel like they're not known, that they can't be themselves, that they have to wear a mask. So if you're looking to help people move from exile into hope, all you have to do is look in the pews around you and get to know the people around you. And when someone asks you, how you doing, you don't just have to say, oh, I'm good. You can say, today was tough, because this is your church, this is your home, this is your family. This is a place that can draw you from exile and give you hope. The story from Luke 8 tells us about the woman hearing whispers of Jesus. Probably out her window, she'd heard whispers that this Jesus was coming back. And in the study between services that we did in May, we looked at millennials and how now more than ever, there are these competing stories. There are so many stories that people get inundated with about what they should value and what they should like and what they should invest their life into. And so we talked about how our job now is not to be the loudest voice as Christians, but it's to be the most compelling voice. It's to be that whisper of hope. Now, I know Zion, and I know what we're like. I know that we like to leave that Jesus stuff to the pastor, and I know we like to leave that evangelism stuff to the Wednesday night youth program. But it's not just our job as the paid staff, it's your job to do that too. So Zion, I know that you can be timid and you can be shy about it, but all you need to do is speak out that message of hope, that whisper of hope that's drawn you out of exile and given you a life of love and light and hope, and share that. You don't have to shout it from rooftops. You get to just bring it into conversations, that you have hope and you have love and you have light, and that comes through this guy that you think might be the Messiah, Jesus. Lastly, Jesus looked at that woman who everyone thought was worthless. Everyone thought she shouldn't be here. She doesn't deserve to be here. Jesus looked at her and said, daughter. For those moments when you feel like you're in exile or where you feel unworthy, that same Jesus that called her daughter calls you daughter and calls you son this morning. So may you remember that you are the son and the daughter of that same Jesus. May the knowledge of who you are bring you from a place of exile into a place of hope and love and light. It's been my honor for the past 3 years to serve here. May you continue to lean in to your calling as a church, Zion. Amen.